Hello, this is a wearing history sewing tutorial for how to sew a lined shirt yoke. With this one, there's an inside and an outside yoke. First thing you're going to do is match the outside of your blouse to the yoke. This means you're sewing the lining first, so have the right side facing towards you. And you are going to match your center back and your notches. You're going to then ease all of your gathers all the way across. This is sped up so you can get a better idea without having to, watch me forever. There's two gathering threads here. I ran them at 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch. You check your seam allowance because it depends on what pattern you're using, what you're going to use for your gathering lines. You're going to evenly distribute it across. And again, this is joining it to the lining. So the seam allowance will be facing out towards you as if you were wearing it, and that's exactly what you want. You want the right side facing towards you so that the seam allowance is facing out. That way when the lining gets turned up, the seam allowance will be encased. You're going to attach it on top using a lapped seam, you'll see in a second. So distribute this evenly across. If you're using my Montana shirt blouse, you're not going to have a lot of gathers, so you're just going to ease what you can across. The heavier the fabric is, the less gathering you're going to see. The lighter it is, there's more little gathers. It just depends on the weight of your fabric. So just try to get it so that it looks somewhat even. You can wiggle it around with your fingers, and then you're going to sew it with your seam allowance, which is 1/2 inch. After this, you're going to lay everything on the table with the right sides of the front facing up, and you're going to pin the seam allowance like so for your shoulders. So you can see now that the seam allowance is facing out towards the right side of the garment. This is exactly what you want. It's going to feel a little bit weird, but that's what you want to do with this. After it's pinned, you're going to sew it at the seam allowance, which is 1/2 inch for this pattern. And you can see it's all sewn here. You can remove your gathering threads from the blouse, and you're going to press all the seam allowance towards the inside, which means facing up as if you were wearing it. Then press under the seam allowance of your yoke and lay it on top here. This is what's called a lapped seam. It means that you meet the folded edge of the garment with the stitch line of the other garment. So essentially you are going to top stitch it into place, which makes it exactly where it's supposed to be. So when you pin this across, make sure that you pay attention to grain and make sure nothing is pulling really weird, and make sure you just cover it enough to cover the first row of stitching. You don't want that stitching to be visible after this is finished. So if you need to cheat out your seam allowance a little bit, it's totally okay to do. I also need to note that I top stitched my yoke seam allowance. Sorry, not top stitched, but stay stitched it. You don't need to do this unless you want to. If you stay stitch it at the seam allowance, you won't be able to cheat it out because then that line's going to be visible. After this, you smooth it up. You want to make sure there's no bubbles or wrinkles. First thing I do is match center back. Pay attention to what your neckline is doing here too. You don't want to distort your neckline. So just take your time, smooth everything nice and slowly. This is sped up quite a bit. So, I'm not really going this fast. Take your time, pin where you need to, and make sure that you cover that first line of stitching just barely, just so it's not visible when it's worn. Again, this is a lapped seam. You'll see this a lot with vintage sewing. Just take your time, make sure that you smooth it really nicely, and pin it so it's covering that seam allowance. And then you can move on to the next step, which will be stitching it on the sewing machine right along that edge. So you can see kind of what I've done when it's really close up. I have a 1/8 inch guide on my sewing machine foot, and that's how I did this. I sped this up quite a lot. So make sure you take your pins out as you go so you don't get any mishaps with broken needles or broken pins. I always have the extra body of the shirt facing out from the sewing machine, not towards the inside. I find that's a lot easier when doing this sort of seam because it can get a little bit unwieldy because of all of the extra fabric because you're used to just having the seam allowance facing towards the sewing machine. So just make sure you take your time and go slow and smooth all of your layers out so you don't unintentionally catch any of the underneath part. So I sewed this at 1/8 of an inch, which is just on that inside crevice of my 1/4 inch foot. You can even go as small as a 1/16. You just want to make sure that you grab all these layers and that if you were to wash this, that it wouldn't release. So I'm going to cross the big long back yoke right now. Make sure that you back stitch, and then that's pretty much it. I'll show you what it looks like when you're done. Make sure you give it another press, and it's all enclosed. It looks beautiful and no visible seam allowance at all. This was really good for work shirts because it meant they lasted forever. I hope you found this tutorial useful. I think it's a really easy way to put a lining in a shirt without having to worry about turning things in weird ways. Alright, thanks very much. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. You can get the patterns on wearinghistory.clothing and e-patterns at Wearing History on Etsy.